My name is Paul Nunes-Dier. I'm a certified professional facilitator from the IAF, which stands for International Association of Facilitators. Since 2018, I've started a book series on architecting collaboration, and my latest book, in co-authorship with Martin Duffy and other renowned digital facilitators and guest co-authors, is titled Beyond Virtual Meetings. It's all about the importance of the digital tools that can extend and augment the power of you as a facilitator and a meeting host in virtual online meetings, but also on the hybrid meetings that are going to be so much needed in this post-pandemic era. Along with my co-author Martin Duffy and esteemed PhD colleague, we host Talk to Your Meeting Doctors, a series of hosted conversations with meeting experts that can advise you about how to transition to this new normal and take advantage of this incredible once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make the organization of your meetings more sustainable and effective. Please stand by as the next show will start momentarily.
Ladies and gentlemen, another episode of Talk to Your Meeting Doctors. As usual, with me, Martin Duffy, and today with a special guest here today, Ruud Jason. I'm briefly summarizing Ruud Jason, as you can find him on LinkedIn. On his profile, he describes himself as a designer of time. But I'm sure Martin will unpeel that in a minute for all of us. Ruud founded a company called Event Design Collective. But as you're going to find out, this is perhaps not much of a company, but something else. Maybe it's a movement. You have to find out. And we hope this conversation will help you shed light on what Ruud Jason have created here with this organization. It's today a multinational organization covering all corners of the world, Ruud, right? Ruud, besides being the founder and managing partner of this organization, Event Design Collective, in the past, he was already involved in similar organizations like the New Objective Collective, where I believe I met him in that days in an event in Switzerland, where he lives right now. He's also an accredited MPI global trainer, founder and creator of TEDx Basel. He was a former marketing director in a Congress group, so it's a person with lots of experience in what we call the meeting industry, right? But over to you, Martin and Ruud. We have a question we normally start with in our episodes.
Yeah, just a little teaser, Ruud, and it's more about yourself than anything else. But is there anything just about your personal background or your experience that isn't very well known, but that you're happy to share with our listeners and our colleagues?
Wow. Martin, I'm very inspired by your musical backdrop, and you just shared with me that on occasion, 3 times a year, or when the grandkids come by, you pull one of those instruments off the wall and bring the music to life. So I too am well, sometimes I like to call it a failed musician, or I'm really glad I never became a professional musician, because it's one of the hobbies I enjoy a lot.
Fantastic.
And funnily enough, I recently participated in 7 years ago when I moved to 15 years ago, I moved to Switzerland, and 7 years ago, after I stopped playing the trumpet for 30 years, I picked up a local instrument called the Alphorn.
Oh, yes.
And I've been playing that for the past 7 years, practicing very hard on only 16 notes that form a harmonic.
Oh, wow.
And this instrument has brought me into completely new circles of activity. And we performed in front of the US Capitol last year. We just did a Guinness Book of World Record on a bunny slope here in Switzerland with 1,006 Alphorn players.
Yes.
So events happen in all spaces, but when the hobby drives it, I find is a very motivating element, especially when it's something that's really hard to do. and you really have to apply yourself. Yeah.
Fantastic. Oh, I love that. As a Swiss citizen myself, Ruth, which I shared with you before we came live on air.
Yes.
That's fantastic. I might just take it up myself at some point. That sounds really, really interesting. And I did read about that world record in the Swiss Review, which I get every month.
Yeah.
I read about that world record, which was magnificent. It's
Yeah.
what
Well,
a story.
I was one of the 1,006 people attempting to play for
fantastic.
5 minutes straight, and
Brilliant.
it apparently worked.
So you're a world record holder, actually.
Well, when I see the Guinness World Records that come by lately, because I really had no real idea what it entailed, it's interesting. You can get a world record in just about anything. And Alphorn Playing seemed to have a record that I think was 500 and something, and they expected at least 555, but I got 1,006 people on one mountainside playing together, which was in itself just a phenomenal.
That must have sounded. That was something magic, absolutely magic.
Well, I was a bit concerned about the loudness of it, right? But actually, because you're in the open air and it was right over the field, Waldstättersee, on Klevenalp, just on top of a mountain, the music dissipates very nicely and could apparently be heard up to 10 kilometers away. So,
what an experience! What an event to be part of! Absolutely fantastic.
And it was organized in a Swiss excellence way, in terms of everything was organized from A to Z, including personalized QR codes for each participant to make sure that it was counted properly. Everybody got personalized train tickets to travel from their home with their partner to the gondola, and exactly calculated so there was no waiting line at the gondola, because there's limited capacity of bringing people up the mountain. Things can be engineered and designed to a degree where they feel like an experience perfection, and they didn't leave much to chance, to be honest. It was very well done. Yeah.
And just picking up on a theme, because that segues us into our theme for today, picking up on a point that Paul made in introducing you, a designer of time. Yeah. And what a wonderful analogy, given the Swiss preference for timekeeping, and as you exemplified their management of events such that time is critically cared for. In that context, Ruud, you're from the event and part of the event industry. Your experience in the past, one of the most common complaints that I've heard executives say about meetings is wasting time. What would you have to say about that from an event manager's perspective?
Well, granted, I'm a terrible event manager, but I am obsessed by event design. I think the two are two different skill sets. I think wasting time is a cardinal sin. And let me explain that. Nobody at the end of their life, looks up from their deathbed and thinks to themselves, I wish I've spent more money on XYZ, right?
Yeah.
It usually includes, the quotient of time is usually included in what people say at the end of their lives. And it usually pertains to, I wish I would have spent more time doing ... right? And so time in itself is the currency we all have in equal quantity, right? Or at least we all have the responsibility of how we spend it. So I think also as an event designer, we're complicit if people waste our time, because we have a choice, right? We have a choice to step away from that situation. Whether that's kind or unkind, it should be left up to the one that decides how time is best invested, right? So at the Event Design Collective, I have this thing on my desk every time, because this is kind of what, with a small mission and or a small team and a giant mission, this is what we do, right? It's to try to figure out how does your event create value? And if a meeting is an event, it equates to a certain value, but the value should be expressed in time. And that's why we added this, right? To craft, quantify, and celebrate progress over time. So progress over time is probably the quotient that people are desiring when they say, you know, this meeting was a total waste of time, or this was time very well invested. I wish I could have spent more time with that group of people doing this thing that we were doing, whatever it was.
Yeah.
People have a very well built-in barometer and a sensation of how their time is being spent. And I think we should each be very conscious of what that barometer says at every moment of the day. If you take other people's time, you better do it with a very conscious sense of how you orchestrate the time, right, if you will. Orchestrating time. Always on my desk, I have this little, you know, time machine, right, which is a very old version of the Swiss watch, which I also, you know, I find very precious. Just timekeeping devices, I find endlessly fascinating, because how we choose to spend it is really the essence of life, right? So if you're a designer of time, or maybe back to that conversation that you were mentioning before, is if you own a meeting, or people have meetings in organizations, and the meetings about meetings take more time than the actual events that they're supposed to put together, or the changes that are driven by those meetings, then there's a question as to whether that design is effective or efficient, and what could be done to do that differently, right? So yeah, time is it's endlessly fascinating, just like music for me.
Yeah, you've touched on a perspective about the time spent in meetings that actually I don't think we've come across that before, Ruud. And that's the idea of crafting, quantifying, and celebrating. Could you expand that idea as you use it in your events a little bit more, just to give a sense of how you bottom that out and the value that you put on those criteria?
Yeah. Well, maybe that boils down to the work that we've been focusing on for the past decade and a bit, which, if you look at music as an example, Martin, is music is a universal language that people can do with or without sheet music, right?
Yeah.
You can be a really good musician without reading sheet music.
Absolutely.
But if you want to scale, if you want to record, if you want to compose, if you want to geographically displace music over the planet or beyond, you need some way of recording it, coding it, decoding it, and figuring out how others interpret it from their perspective, right? So about 10 years ago, in February of 2014, we launched something called the Event Canvas, which is, some people have called it sheet music for events. It's based on two core principles. The first being, if you look at the definition of a meeting or an event, let's use event, because I think events are more holistic. I think it takes a bigger perspective. To us, an event is anything that gathers two or more stakeholders, right? So two kinds of group of people or more that have a stake in whatever is going on, and that there is behavior change happening between those stakeholders during that event, during that meeting, or maybe in between the meetings that they're holding, right? There's two concepts. There's the meeting itself and what happens in between the meetings.
Okay.
So behavior change and multiple stakeholders, those are the two ingredients that you can play around with. And when you decode how those events create value, it's really from the fact that somebody comes in with one behavior and goes away with another behavior, and something happens in between. And it's the in-between space that's so interesting, because that's where the world of facilitation, orchestration, interpretation, communication, all those elements are locked up in that. And if you look at the Event Canvas, which we shared under Creative Commons to a community of practice, right? So people can download that for free. It's been translated to 18 languages by a community of practice because they found function in it, just like sheet music. We don't care who created sheet music. We don't care who created the Event Canvas. It's about the practice of using that tool to better decode how to spend the time. And in the middle of the canvas, you'll see there's 14 cubicles, but the two core ones in the middle pertain to time, right? So it also looks like an hourglass, right? So it looks exactly like this thing. And the top part of it is the experience journey of all these chronological touch points. And the
Yeah.
bottom part is, as a result of going through the experience, what did I learn as a result of going through that experience, right? Skills, knowledge, people learning, attitude learning. There's different things that happen when people interact. Different things can happen on the bottom. And so quantifying the design restrictions around that, the context of the meeting, so to say, is what we call the design frame. These are all the elements that restrict. And restrictions are great because they inspire to create, right?
Yeah.
They're inspirational for the creation part. And the outside frame is really called the change. It's really, how do you go in? How do you go out? So it's so simple. Anybody can use it. It's not rocket science. Everybody can think about these components. The question is, can you think of it from multiple perspectives and then stack them in a way that you can orchestrate it so that the crafting, the quantifying, celebrating of progress over time is done effectively, so it creates value for both parties or for all parties involved in that event. That's the critical thing, right? Martin, you were talking about your grandkids. And when we wrote the event design handbook, funnily enough, we first asked ourselves the question, how would we explain this to a 7-year-old or to our grandma?
Yeah.
And over lunch, we forced ourselves to write the story of Elsa turning 8 years old. And then looking at it through the lens from Elsa, the birthday girl, looking at it through the lens of the parents, and looking at it through the lens of the grandparents. 3 completely different perspectives as to how you celebrate a birthday. And we mapped it out in less than an hour over lunch. We mapped out a visual story. It's now part of the case studies of the Event Design Handbook. And funnily enough, now we find ourselves that Dennis, who does all the visuals in our books, Elsa is actually his daughter. Okay. And now we have to write the story plus 10 years because it's been actually plus 8 years because the book came out in 2016. But Elsa is now turning 16, and so we can redo the basic story.
Super.
Because ultimately that time and how you spent it has different functions for the grandparents, for the parents, and for the kid, right? Now, every event is kind of like this. I'm not saying every event is a birthday party, but every event has multiple stakeholders, certain behavior changes, and certain pains as you go into them, certain expectations. They all commit to something when they go to this thing, right? They expect something in return. It comes at a cost or maybe a revenue to some of them, right? It has jobs to be done, and there's a promise for this event, and there's returns or things you get as a result of being at this event, behavior changes, and a level of satisfaction offset against the expectation. So the decoding of how this thing creates value to see if it creates progress over time is embedded in the design process, because when a group of people thinks together from multiple perspectives and decodes it, spends a little bit of time doing that, the outcome of how you can do the events and the prototypes that come out the other end tend to be much more diverse and different, because you put collective brain power from multiple people together to come with what comes out the other end, right? So it's not just the smartest person in the room, it's actually the room that does the thinking, right? And so the hardest part about doing this, and this is what I found in our practice, the community of practice of event designers, is that we've trained people how to do this. It's not rocket science. It's quite simple, really. You know, there's facilitation kits and practical things to go through the process. It's very systematic. The hardest thing is claiming the time of the people to think about it. The thing is, if a picture is worth 1,000 words, a meeting is worth, or an event design session or prototype is worth 1,000 meetings, right? So if you want to kill the meetings about meetings, you have to have prototypes. How do you create prototypes? It's by having people think together, in a structure that allows for a specific outcome on the other end. And so, and we've also, not that we want Guinness Book of World Records on that, but we've also scaled up that practice and practiced ourselves. How can we scale up the speed at which we do this, or the effectivity of it? And very recently, we designed a brand new event series or we're doing that together with IEEE, one of the largest associations on the planet of electrical engineers. And we got 212 of their board members and event people together, right? They do 2,500 events a year, but when they design a new event, we actually use their event about events to design a new event that's going to be a new series. 212 people got together facilitated by 13 facilitators, to create from 13 different perspectives the Climate Change Clean Tech Conference that's going to happen next year in Glasgow. We got them together in Hawaii to think about what does that look like in the future. So when you talk about scaling or finding the purpose of getting people together, gathering them to use their brain power to create a better future state for a much larger group of people, it scales up, right? Just in the way that a composer could write on sheet music, a conductor could interpret it for a bigger orchestra, 16 orchestra could play it in real time together, right? And you could scale up the music very easily because you have a recorded version of what it could be in its original interpretation. Now, the biggest challenge for a CEO or for somebody that owns a company or an organization is that if they try to facilitate this process, the golden rule is you cannot contribute. As a facilitator, you orchestrate. You don't play the instrument. So the purpose of a facilitator is to make sure that everyone that needs to have a voice in that can also have a voice, right? Like you were asking before, at what point do you facilitate yourself?
Yeah.
And at what point do you bring in an external facilitator? Now, if you want all of the voices heard and provide input or specific voices, then every one of these players has a specific role. And by orchestrating the roles, I think you have much more clarity in the orchestra as to how things work.
Yeah.
And then the design process becomes just much more effective because the input brain power is done by those that have, the power of third thought, so to say, right? This ability to bring in thinking from external sources. Yeah. And the facilitator orchestrates the brain power, which is hard in itself, but the facilitator is not responsible for the outcome. They're responsible for the process.
The process, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. But I'm talking to the converted here, so the meetings doctors around the table here know exactly how this works.
But you've raised some really, really interesting concepts there, Ruud. Let me take you back to one particular one which really struck me, maybe because you pulled at my heartstrings when you mentioned grandchildren. It's the intergenerational, the generational perspectives. Mm-hmm. That idea. Can you just expand that a little bit for us in what conclusions or what insights did you get from looking at meetings and events through that intergenerational lens?
Yeah. So the number one question or the number one concern most of our organizational clients have that work with us or that learn about event design and apply it in their own organization, 9 out of 10 times boils down to how do we get the next generation involved in what we're doing, right? If the average age of your event remains constant or increases by 1 every year, your event will become a dinosaur very quickly, right? So how do you rejuvenate? How do you get next generations to connect to the situation? Let's go back to the example I was talking about before, where we're designing in Hawaii for IEEE on a clean tech conference for 2025. We had one of the 13 stakeholders we identified was the young professionals or the next generation that needs to become part of how technical solutions in clean tech can provide solutions for reducing carbon emissions and maximizing climate change to plus 1.5 degrees Celsius. Just in having the conversation and figuring out who to design for, right, the stakeholder alignment conversation, which is the first step in this, there was a really clear focus on the fact that this should be one of the core stakeholders that needs to be involved in this, because it's the bigger mission of the whole organization to involve the next generation to become part of the thinking, right?
Yeah.
Now, typically what's kind of interesting in events and in associations or in membership-based organizations or in corporations for that matter, Martin, with your grandkids, you now probably have more time than ever to spend time with your grandkids, while you were raising your own kids. Your time was strapped, right?
Yes,
it was
absolutely.
You're at a different stage in your career. You're managing a young family. You're probably traveling. You're doing things that are, maybe some people are even studying. And and in this case, we were talking about young professionals. And very quickly, when the analysis was done from the stakeholder perspective of this young professional, people said, well, there's two kinds of young professionals because we have to dissect them further. We have the people that are still studying.
Mm-hmm.
who might be PhD students or master's degree students, and we have people that are young professionals in their first, second, third job, in their late 20s, early 30s. Getting them to spend time on, between brackets, extracurricular activities to develop their thinking, to connect to a new network, it sounds like the thing that you do on top of when you have the other things under control in your, pyramid of needs.
Yeah.
This sounds more like self-deployment, right? Or self-fulfillment, where, when you're good at your job or you got that under control, you know how to manage your family, your health is in good order, et cetera, then you might take on more tasks.
Yeah.
Like volunteer leadership roles, like contributing to committees, like maybe going to conferences, whatever it might be. And so very quickly, that how you spend your time and how it creates value for you needs to be made visible by the organization that's looking to involve that next generation, right?
Yeah.
Why does Elsa go to her 8th birthday party? It's because she has an expectation of what the promise of that event is, right? The parents were looking for that family picture perfect moment to get together. Elsa, very naively in this book 8 years ago, wanted her first iPad. Her parents were adamant they were not going to give her an iPad because that's ridiculous for an 8-year-old. And grandpa and grandma, who had some money to spend and wanted to spend more time with their kids, saw that an iPad might be a pretty good solution, not just to get back at the parents in a very tongue-in-cheek way, but also to spend more time because she could explain to them how the iPad works and hang out with her from time to time when she wasn't able to travel to see the grandparents. Now, the malicious conspiracy in this story, as you can feel it coming, is there's tension between the wants and the needs of the different stakeholders. And it's in the tension, actually in the canvas, there's the 14 cubicles and there's the lines in between. And when we were doing work with the Federation of European Risk Management Associations quite some time back, they said, what's interesting is it's not just about the spaces that we fill in the canvas, but the lines are actually risk lines, that if you cross one of the lines or you bend the lines, that's where the risk and reward lines lie, and we need to study them more closely. And that blew our mind because we had never designed it to do that. But when you think about it, you go, they're probably right. We never saw it from that perspective until they invited us to look at it in that way.
Yeah. So there's two themes from what you just spoken about there, versus what you spoke about previously around the event canvas. It's this idea of perspective. It's the different perspectives of the participants in a shared event. So again, I'm just picking up on a point that you made much earlier on, where we all have the same amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
We all have the same watch, but our perspective on how that time is being used. So that idea of perspective, then, again, I'm trying to translate that in my mind's eye into an organization, not necessarily now an event, but let's say the recurring executive teams meeting every Monday or every month or whatever it is. So that idea of perspective, could you expand that thought for us just a little bit, in the pure meeting context and or in the event context?
Mm-hmm. So I think the perspective is so important because you can, by training, you can shift perspectives. You can shift focus and you can shift perspective. It requires effort, right? And so we use empathy mapping to get people into a certain perspective, right? And try to figure out, one of the classic exercises we do whenever we train people in event design is we get a group of people that might have never met before, and we ask them to design the opening of the Olympics for Brisbane 2032, whatever is upcoming in the future. And it sounds like a massively difficult example to design off the cuff if you've never done this before, right? Or if you're familiar with other events but haven't never done the opening of the Olympics. And what's funny is, as soon as people identify who the stakeholders are, and they say, oh, you have athletes who go to the opening of the Olympics, and you might be, the president, CEO of the International Olympic Committee, or you might be the host city, or very quickly in the person's mind develops a perspective as to what it means, right? Now, to extrapolate and dig into that perspective, we asked them to walk, a couple of miles in the shoes of this person for about an hour by doing pre-event empathy mapping, post-event empathy mapping, and then filling out the event canvas. And what's very interesting is that very often, even if none of the people in the room were Olympic athletes or have ever chaired the International Olympic Committee, after 15 minutes of empathizing and going through what does this person see in the future, what do they think and feel, what do they hear, what do they say and do, what are their pains, what are their gains, a group of people can get into that perspective. Is it perfect? Probably not.
Sure.
But you get very close to the truth, and you can validate the outcoming stories with the respective stakeholder if you wanted to, which we always try to do.
Yeah.
Because presenting them with a situation where they look at a little 1-minute clip or whatever the time duration might be, and allowing them to reflect on, here's what 7 people or 14 people thought you were thinking right now and what you're saying and doing, et cetera, 6 months before the event. And here's what they think and say and do after the event's been delivered very successfully. They thought about you for an hour, and here's how they bottled up the story. And you hold that up in front of the person whose stake you think it represents, and they will spot the 10 differences and indicate, oh, it's really good you thought of this, and it's fantastic. This is really important to me, but you forgot this. And here's the thing that's really critical for me and my success. And you underestimated this and overestimated that. It's much easier to reflect on the mirror than to start from a blank slate.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And this is where I think, classical survey systems and things are, fairly hopeless unless you present a given situation to a degree of imperfection, where the person is allowed to tune it into their real perspective. You see what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, that's actually you've just prompted me to think of another aspect that came up in one of our previous conversations, actually, with Joe Allen, Professor Joe Allen. You mentioned training, that we can shift perspectives by training, but interestingly, and Joe says this specifically, and Joe is a recognized world expert in meetings and meeting training. There is virtually no training provided in the conduct of meetings anywhere on any program, undergraduate, postgraduate. And given the amount of time, so we'll go back to your central theme, we've all got shared time. However, the value that we get out of using that time can be vastly different. But we don't ever seem to train anybody in the art of using time when we meet. I'd be really interested to hear your views or your perspectives on that.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to have to correct the professor then.
Okay. Good.
only because we started about 6 years ago. We started a program called the Event Design Certificate Program for Young Professionals, which has now been rolled out into 35 universities across the planet. Super. And people in bachelor's degrees and master's degrees are learning about event design as a conceptual skill set to apply in their future careers, right? So, and every quarter, every year, thousands of people come out of this program now with that basic skill set under their belts. Now, when I said we're a small team with a big mission, the way we scaled that is we taught the university professors the methodology, and they became a certified event designer, which is basically, how do I apply the methodology of event design and allow a team become a proficient facilitator of it, so that others can use that facilitation skill when they conduct that. And those certified event designers are now teaching. Many of them are faculty members in these universities, and they teach this to the next generation. So for me, this is a really critical thing to expand, because, as you said, the organizations where people are proficient at doing this and are applying it is increasing, but very slowly, right? Yeah. If we want to make real change happen, it is about the next generation coming into that workspace with the skill set of facilitation and our application to something very pragmatic that has a very large set of dissatisfiers, right? Most people in early career, mid-career, late career, whatever career, retirement career, they hate the meetings about meetings, or they hate the meetings, full stop. Now, if we don't teach it, as you said, and if we don't equip people with the ability to redesign them effectively, how do we expect that to change?
It won't
Right.
change,
So
yeah.
yeah. So
But
here again is where our little Swiss Army knife makes a very small dent in only 35 universities. But 6 years ago, it was 3 pilot program universities, and it took 4 years for it to actually start. And then COVID happened, and we have happened to have a full learning management system with the whole kind of provision of the how to teach this and et cetera, bottled up, which we made because we got so many recurring questions from people who had taken our program and said, how do you do this bit again? And we had to go back into a Zoom call and explain it to them over and over again. And then we said, maybe we should record the whole thing just once and just stick it somewhere and say, oh, look at chapter 3.2, right? Or module, whatever. And when we did that the year before COVID, we noticed that almost nobody started using it. And then COVID hit. And then all of a sudden, many universities said to themselves, we need to use remote facilitation skills. We need to have content that's packaged both in books, facilitation kits, in structures, but also in online learning management systems with quizzes and whatever it might be, to measure progress over time, celebrate it, quantify it, and then be able to see if the skill set can be applied afterwards to the specific skill set. And what we had built for one purpose for the people that were certified event designers, well, after they went through the program, they didn't need that because they knew how it worked. But the students and the university professors having to teach it, and you probably and many of your viewers know that if you want to teach something, you really need mastery of that subject.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now all of a sudden, this became the jumping off stone, and it went from 3 programs to 35 in less than 2 years.
Fantastic. Yeah.
So there's hope for that subject, hopefully. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Just a final question, Ruud, if I may. That idea of event design certificate, that program in the 35 universities, the content of that program, how applicable would you say that is to routine, regular organizational meetings versus events as, separate, long-term, big scale? So those two perspectives, does it equally apply to both, or are there subtle differences?
Great question. And I think the key there is we have a saying, show me an organization's event or meeting and I'll tell you about their culture, right?
100%.
Now,
100%.
if you blindfolded me and brought me to any of the meetings that you were talking about, you could read the culture very quickly, right? Now, some people think when you hear about event design, oh, that's for the big complicated events, big conferences, etc. No, it is also for the recurring, the design of our podcast, the Design to Change podcast, has an event design at the foundations of it. What you guys do in this format has a entry and exit behavior, it has expectations, it has all those elements, and you've probably gone through multiple prototypes, as you mentioned, because you were talking about events at large at first, and now you're talking more specific about the leader's role in orchestrating events effectively. So you have an evolution and you see the progress over time of your format. Now the format doesn't fall out of the sky. Well, sometimes it does. But if you would be forced to write it down and you have clarity about it, it's really easy to write it down, right? I've tried, as a trumpet player, I try to write down Miles Davis's solo in Kind of Blue. And it's possible, right? With a bit of diligence and practice, you can write it down, and then you can practice on your own trumpet and try to get the same thing out. But it might sound very different, right? So it's not just about the coding and decoding of it, but it's also the culture and the context in which you then apply it. And I think this is where the culture of an organization over time and the meetings within that organization, that's where events are the biggest petri dishes of testing out change can happen, right? So good leaders want to enable culture change over time, and they know that events are their microcosm to test new cultures. Those that are good leaders realize that. And they then are much more deliberate about how they design that and how they get their teams to work on it, because the event is what we call the crowbar, if you will, right? It is the pivot points to create new behaviors.
Yeah.
providing you can suspend disbelief of the beliefs, right? So
Yeah.
the whole different kind of worms is the beliefs that lie in front of the behaviors, but
Yeah,
let's
absolutely.
pretend that you can change behaviors if you are able to grasp the right type of context and how people spend that time and consider that to be time well invested instead of time wasted, right? Or time saved. Yeah.
We could be here for hours,
Oh,
Ruud
wow.
and
Yeah,
Martin, but we have to
absolutely,
be
Paul.
conscious of time. It's been
Yeah.
so interesting and amazing, Martin, how our brains are connected, because when I was thinking about the question, you actually posed that question to Ruud. So I love this
I
episode.
could see the synapses
Norm,
jumping in my screen
yeah,
there. Yeah.
Absolutely.
no, but
There's
it's
a bit of
been like,
mind melding going on for sure.
yeah, it's been like almost going for the third year on successive Talk to My Meeting Doctors episodes, so our brains are now almost fusioned. But Martin, we normally end up our conversations with a summary. Have you got enough for summarizing, or should we
Oh, wow.
skip
How
that
do you
one?
summarize that? Crikey. That's called a fire hose discussion. Fantastic. We've been 45 minutes, Ruud, and it feels like about 2 minutes, but wow. And it equally feels like about 3 hours. Paul, you introduced Ruud as a designer of time, which is a fascinating way to think about our meetings and our events. Ruud, you immediately distinguish between event management versus event designing. And let's focus then on event designing. You introduced us to the idea of needing more time to do what? And we can make choices, we can create value. You summarized with crafting, quantifying and celebrating the value of time. With that in mind, you then introduce us to the event canvas, which is kind of your core philosophy, if you want, if I've interpreted that correctly. And you mentioned two key elements to that, the idea of multiple stakeholders and bringing about behavior change. Now, you did mention that there's a 14-step element mixed into all of that. So obviously, I'm really parsing out something quite big into something very small here. You then introduced us to the story behind the book that yourself and your colleagues wrote about 9 years ago with the 8-year-old, which introduced us to the idea of generational perspectives and how the different perspectives of the participants in events need to be taken into account. And you again brought us into the idea of stakeholder analysis, empathy stakeholder analysis, or empathetic stakeholder analysis. You mentioned, but we didn't get to explore the idea of the collective brain, which is a theme or a topic that I'd really love to come back to. And I have a personal interest in that from my own background. We might come back to that another day, Ruud, if we could be so bold. The challenge of getting time to think was a key question that you spoke about. And the power then of using facilitation. So where executives need time to think, they can benefit from having facilitation because now they can participate. The facilitator doesn't participate, they manage the process to get an outcome. Whereas by bringing a facilitator to an event, the executive has the possibility to engage rather than run the event.
Yeah.
You then posed a key fundamental question that actually has been a recurring theme with us in this podcast series for the last 3 years. And that is, why do people take part in the events? And if we don't bottom out that question, then we're going to lose at least half, if not all, of the participants to an event. You corrected me absolutely correctly in saying that we do actually have education in events in 35 universities through the event design certificate. I was really delighted to hear that, and I'd love to hear more about that. Maybe that's another podcast, Paul, that we could do at some point. There's a final point that you made, your very last comment. I've written it down, and I think it's a fantastic analogy. But events, and I'll call them meetings, because big or small, I think they're the same. They're the petri dishes of culture and culture change. There's an expression that I've used myself over a number of our podcasts, and that is that meetings are the window to the soul of the organization. But I think you've characterized it in a very different but actually, I think more provocative way. I think calling it the Petri dishes of culture and culture change, I think that's a fantastic way to summarize what meetings and events of any organization are and should be.
Fantastic, fantastic. Thank you so much, Martin, and thank you so much, Ruth, for spending the time with us. Yes, it's always a pleasure to be here. And dear viewers, I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did.
Absolutely.
And looking forward to your wonderful comments every time we are on the air. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Ruth, Martin. Let's call it for the day, right?
Well done, Ruth. Thank you very much
much
indeed.
Thank you, Martin and Paul. And Martin, chapeau on this summary that I think AI can eat their heart out in listening skills, analytical skills, and interpreting the core essence. Thank you so much.